All right, folks, happy Tuesday. We're starting a new topic today, as promised. We are going into probably one of my favorite topics, actually, of the whole school year, of life for sure, but definitely of the whole school year as well. This is pretty interesting stuff, which I think you'll really enjoy. Hopefully, you've been enjoying a lot of this life stuff. But today we're talking about evolution by natural selection, and maybe you've heard of this phrase down here: survival of the fittest. That's what we're going to be talking about. What does it mean to be fit? And then what does that mean for your genetics? Where do they go after you've died if you're fit versus if you're unfit? There's a whole lot to it. So let's go ahead and start off by talking about, let me get rid of that. Talking about evolution, because you might have some experience, I guess, with evolution. So there's really two schools of thought of evolution that are kind of separate. So there's evolution with a common ancestor. And then there's evolution, ancestors, I guess, by natural selection. Okay. So two different schools of thought. Natural selection is what we're going to be focusing on. And in your notes here, there's at the very beginning, I've got a space for you where I want you to kind of tell me what you've already heard about evolution. Evolution can be a pretty, what's the word I'm looking for here? Controversial topic, I guess. It gets a lot of heated arguments going. There's a lot of people that have religious beliefs that don't seem to match up with scientific understanding of evolution. And that's fine. I'm not here to shake up anybody's beliefs. I'm just here to present to you what scientists know, or what we assume based off of evidence that we have, making an inference based on evidence. So really, evolution doesn't have to be this big, icky word. But this one over here, common ancestor evolution, really is where you get the controversy. That's where you're saying that all species on Earth came from one original living creature, whether it's a blob in a pool of water or whether it's, whatever. That one creature in the very beginning of life branched out and made all these separate creatures. And so you kind of see that picture. I'm not going to draw this because it'll be terrible, of like the monkey, and then he gets a little bit more upright and then more upright, and then he's got a spear, and then he's a human. So that's evolution by common ancestor. And that's where you get a lot of the arguments. And the reason behind that, I would guess, is because it's more inference based. Okay. It's more saying, here's some fossils that we found, here's skeletal remains that we found, and here's what we think it means. Now, evolution by natural selection, you cannot argue this one the same way that you can argue common ancestor, because we can literally observe natural selection happening all the time. It's right in front of our eyes today. Evolution by common ancestors is more about looking at the past and trying to piece together the fossil record. You remember we talked about the fossil record. It's always going to be imperfect because we're never going to have all of the fossils, and we're never going to have them all because many of them are already gone or destroyed or buried so far in the earth that we'll never find them. So natural selection, I enjoy talking about because it's not controversial. You can't argue this one. It's observable. Common ancestor is a little bit more inference based, so it's not observable today, and that's where you have some argument. But we're going to focus on natural selection. That's where we're going from here. And so the whole point of this conversation is, don't feel like I'm trying to challenge something that you believe. I'm presenting to you something observable. We're not going to get into the common ancestor evolution as we go through this. Okay, so first things first, if you have ever heard of natural selection, you have heard of this guy. This is Charles Darwin, a great scientist to know of. He's going to pop up probably the rest of your school career. You're going to hear about Charles Darwin, especially if you take biology. You're going to be hearing about this guy. So that's him in the bottom corner there. He was an English guy born in 1809. He was a big plant and animal fan, and a really good sketch artist. You're going to see some of his drawings here in a second. Remember, in 1809, you don't have a camera. So if you see a creature and you want to document it, you can't just, snap a picture of it. You've got to be a really good artist. So a lot of these guys that dealt with early life science, they had to be great at drawing. So luckily I didn't exist back then, because my drawings would have been terrible. It would have been, you've seen me draw animals, you would have had no idea what I was talking about. If you are a big, what's the word I'm looking for? Not quiz. I just blanked on it. Trivia. If you're a big trivia fan, there we go. This is a great fact to know. So his boat was called the HMS Beagle, and he went to the Galapagos Islands. So you'll find those in South America. Very famous voyage. If you hear HMS Beagle, you should think Charles Darwin. That'll win you some money on Jeopardy. Very famous trivia question there. Now, he was one of the big, we always talk about big scientists this year. He's one of the big scientists to propose that evolution of species occurs naturally. Now, there's that nasty word everybody hates. Evolution, the word itself just means change over time. So what he's saying is that species can change over time and that it occurs naturally. Okay. Now, that's an interesting thought. How would it occur unnaturally? Kind of creepy stuff we'll talk about later on, but we can actually change species today to look certain ways that we want, which is a little bit weird. But he says that this occurs naturally. Now let's look at some of his sketches. So he goes to the Galapagos Islands on his boat, and he finds finches. And you go to South America, and the best thing you can find is a finch, which we can find in our backyard here. But these finches are a little bit different than any ones that we've seen. So Galapagos Islands, key word there, they are islands. And I don't know if we talked about islands so much. We talked about caves yesterday. And if you remember in Planet Earth, he said that living in an isolated cave leads to some different looking creatures than outside of the cave. The same thing is true on islands. If you go to an island, you're going to find creatures that look different than maybe their mainland cousins. So a lot of those, the weird birds that we looked at that had all the strange mating rituals, they were island birds, and they get that way because they're isolated from the mainland and from the other birds of their species. So Darwin goes to these different islands, and he finds out that the same species, you see these four guys here, the same species can have different traits. He sees that all of their beaks are very, very different. Now, I, again, am just blown away by the detail of those drawings. I wish I could draw like that. But also, this bird always creeps me out. If you just look in his eye there, he will stare right through your soul. So these four finches, they are the same species, yet look at them, and you would say those are four entirely different birds. Although, to me, it looks like 1 and 2 here. These guys definitely look like they're closely related, and 3 and 4 look closely related. But all four of them come from the same species. So the question is, why would birds of the same species have different traits on various islands? I want you to think about this for a second and then tell me your answer, and I will pretend like I can hear you. Oh, very interesting. So what happens is when you are on an island, you have to get your food or survive in different ways. So if you are on an island that has lots of, let's say, worms, the kind of worms that get inside of trees, and you always see like a woodpecker trying to get them. If you're bird number 1 here and you're trying to get worms out of a tree, that beak is pretty worthless, right? You want to be like bird number 4 right here, so that way your beak can reach into small spaces. So these islands present different challenges for survival. And so the reason why we get different traits on different islands is because those particular traits, whether it's a skinny beak or a giant beak, they are better suited for surviving on that island. If you're bird number 1, you're probably really good at, cracking open a walnut or something like that and eating that way. So these different traits are better suited for different environments. And that's why you see different traits on different islands, because not all the islands are going to have the same food sources. Let's keep going here. We're going to talk about DNA real quick again. So traits we know are passed down from parents to offspring. They come from your DNA. This should all be Pretty basic review for you. Now, acquired traits, this is important. Acquired traits right here throughout the life of an organism cannot be passed down. So, in other words, look at my example here. If I work out and I get really huge muscles, I'm not going to have children that come out and they're like, oh, hey, dad, I'm really muscly too. That's an acquired trait that I get. You don't just birth out super muscular babies. That would be just kind of creepy and bizarre. Now, can my babies also get strong and muscular? Yeah, depending on how they live their life. But just because I acquire a trait doesn't mean that it goes into my DNA. I can't dye my hair blue and then all my children will have blue hair, right? It doesn't work like that. So acquired traits do not get passed down. It has to be in your DNA. Okay. Now, this is really important for something that we're about to talk about. So remember this idea. You cannot acquire a trait and then pass it down. Same reason why I can't chop off my arm and then all my offspring would have one arm. Okay. It doesn't work like that. My DNA is still coded to have two arms, whether I have two arms or not. Okay. So natural selection is the process by which organisms that inherit advantageous traits reproduce more successfully. This is the big one. I'm going to put it in like this purpley pinky thing. You got to understand this, okay? If I have an advantageous trait, if I have something that's an advantage that makes me better, then I'm more likely to successfully reproduce than somebody that doesn't have that advantage, okay? Now, where do we get these advantages from? They come from genetic mutations, okay? This is the big one, genetic mutations. So genetic variation occurs naturally across all species. What do I mean by genetic variation? I mean different beak sizes in finches, different colors in starfish, anything along those lines. It's natural, okay? We see genetic mutations in humans all the time. We see them in any creature. Any living thing can experience a genetic mutation. Now, not all genetic mutations are beneficial, okay? I can get a genetic mutation that gives me a nasty disease, okay? Is that going to make me have an advantageous trait and reproduce more successfully? No. If I have a nasty disease, odds are I'm not going to live very long and I'm not going to make it to the point in my life where I reproduce, okay? And therefore that doesn't get passed down. But let's say, I don't know. Let's say I'm a monkey, okay? And I get a trait that makes my tail stronger than my siblings, okay? And we're swinging in trees. They have weak tails. They fall out of the tree and die. I have a strong tail. I live, okay? When I reproduce, guess what my offspring are going to get? They're going to get that strong tail trait, okay? A little bit of a morbid example there. Sorry to all my monkey siblings that died. So genetic mutations that lead to good things tend to get passed on later in future generations. Genetic mutations that lead to bad things tend to get wiped out because if you have a bad trait, you are not going to live to reproduce. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's keep going here. So animals that end up with genetic mutations that create an advantage tend to survive better than those without it. And then that advantage gets passed down and becomes more common. That's basically what we just talked about. But I wanted to go to the bears here because I think that this is a fascinating collection of images. So we know Earth's environment is always changing, right? In our Earth Science unit, we talked about all the changes, whether it's weathering and erosion, whether it's earthquakes, whether it's volcanoes, environmental changes in terms of climate. You know, the Earth is never one static way. We even talked about continents that are moving. So, I mean, it's never the same all the time. Now, when the Earth changes, it makes animals or living things adapt to the surroundings, because if they don't, they're gone, right? So an animal's ability to adapt to their surroundings leads to different looks in the same species. So we're looking at all bears here. Now, obviously, they're not all the same species, but they're all of the same family. But look at the similarities and the differences, because I love this. First, look at their environments, okay? If you put this polar bear in this brown field right here, it's so easy to see, right? Anybody's going to be able to see it. So imagine that polar bear trying to hunt in this brown area. All of his prey are going to see him coming from like 10 miles away. So there's no way he's going to be able to be a successful hunter. Now, obviously, the brown bear would have the same problem if he was hunting in the snow. It just wouldn't work out that way. So it's not by chance that this happens, right? The traits that make you successful in your environment tend to show up more often than the ones that make you unsuccessful. Picture for a moment that all of these polar bears, all of these black bears here lived in this region. Okay. Are they going to be successful? No, they're all going to start dying off because they're too easy to see. They're never going to catch any prey. They're not going to be able to eat. But imagine for a second that one of these black bears has an offspring that has a genetic mutation that makes their fur white. Okay. How's that white bear going to do? He's going to do incredibly well compared to his siblings. Therefore, that an advantageous trait is going to be passed on. He's going to live and he's going to be able to reproduce and pass that on. Okay. Hopefully this makes sense. This is the basics of it. If you have a thing that makes you good, you tend to survive better than a thing that makes you bad. Let's look at a challenge question here. Okay. Can natural selection only take place in living things that reproduce through sexual reproduction? Why or why not? I want you to think about this again. I'm going to give you a moment to think this over. I'll recap for you real quick. Sexual reproduction is important because it leads to genetic variation. So you need two partners. Each are going to give half their DNA, and it's going to combine to make genetically different offspring. And then remember, asexual reproduction, all offspring are identical. Okay. So we've got sexual reproduction leads to genetic variation. And then asexual leads to identical. Can natural selection take place in living things? Can it only take place rather in living things that reproduce through sexual reproduction? Give me your answers now, and then we will talk about it. Interesting answers you've got. I'm going to give you a big hint right here. We talked about this 5 weeks ago, maybe somewhere around there. What does this mean? Okay. Let's see if I can see it on the bottle. Yep, there it is. The all important 99%. So if we remember bacteria, we saw a video of them reproducing. They reproduce asexually. So bacteria is what we're going to talk about here. They reproduce asexually, which means one of them splits into two, the two split into four, the four into eight. All of the offspring are identical. Okay. Now, does that mean that there cannot be genetic variation? No, there still can be genetic variation, but it's very rare and hard to come by. So the only way it's possible is through a mutation. Now, remember, we talked about hand sanitizer, and it kills 99.99 whatever percent of sickness causing whatever. Okay. If a bacteria gets a genetic mutation that allows it to survive hand sanitizer, all of the other bacteria will be dead. That one will survive. Now, what does that one do? It reproduces. And then all of its offspring have what? They have the ability to survive hand sanitizer. So natural selection is not limited to just sexual reproduction. Asexual creatures can go through this process as well. And remember, we talked about it. This is a big, big problem, especially today when we're in this world of diseases causing the entire world to shut down. If you have a disease that becomes resistant to our methods of killing it, then that's going to be a huge problem. That's natural selection occurring, though. So you've got bacteria that do this. Remember, we talked about antibiotics, and if you get a prescription, you've got to make sure you take all of the antibiotics, because if you leave any of them alive, any of the bacteria, they can adapt. They can survive that antibiotic, and then the next time you go to take it, when you've got the same bacterial infection, it's not going to be effective, right? So natural selection is not limited to sexual reproduction. But sexual reproduction does tend to make it work better. Why? Because every time you reproduce sexually, you get genetic variation. Whereas if you're reproducing asexually, you kind of have, it's a roll of the dice. You get lucky if you get a mutation that's beneficial. Okay. So quick recap here. Natural selection. I did not mean to hit pause. Hopefully it's still playing. Quick recap. Natural selection. Where's that definition? Right here. Okay. The process by which organisms that inherit advantageous traits reproduce more successfully. Okay. So I've got something that's beneficial. I'm going to live longer, probably. I'll make it to maturity. I'll reproduce. Those good things get passed on. Okay. So genetic mutations are the key to this. Without having genetic change, species would be kind of locked in a certain look, and they would never kind of get this 4 different beak variations. Hopefully this has been beneficial. Make sure you fill out those notes, and then they should, I think you just have to hit turn in. If you go through Classroom and then hit turn in when you're done, and then I'll be able to see them. This is the beginning of natural selection. We'll be doing some labs on this. Obviously they're going to be virtual, which is sad because I miss doing labs in person. I miss doing class in person. We got the news yesterday. Obviously we're not going back, which is a pretty big bummer. Hopefully you guys are doing all right. As always, shoot me an email if you need anything. I'm always around here, just waiting for the option to go back outside. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. See ya.